Hello and welcome to the FATBOSS guide to the Stormwall Blockade on Mythic.
This penultimate boss isn't a whole lot different to the heroic version of the encounter. There are, however, a few mechanical differences, and the primary difficulty in this encounter lies in its tuning. There isn't any real damage check aside from the last phase, where you have multiple adds up that must be killed before they reach the boss, whilst you of course maintain some form of damage up on the boss. However, for the most part, that can be fixed with raid comp.
So to start, you want to limit your melee. We wouldn't recommend for going any more than 4, and ideally you want to run less than that if you can. They're not bad on this fight mechanically, however they're terrible for the last phase when it comes to killing any adds. Ideally any melee you do bring, just tunnel the boss full time and never have to swap, and that isn't a possibility really unless you limit their numbers to around 3 or 4. As for range DPS, if you can choose, you want to stack dot classes. Shadow Priests and Balanced Druids are great for this fight, as it allows the majority of your DPS to focus off the boss in the last phase as adds gradually die off. You do however want one player responsible for keeping the adds slowed at all times, and for this we use a single Frost Mage. As for healing, you'll want to 4-heal this fight, but you can use pretty much any healing comp that you'd like. We'd recommend having at least one strong single target healer such as a monk, as it's useful for the last phase, but ultimately it's not a big deal. This fight from a healing perspective is pretty much cooldown based and not very demanding. For tanks, it's a similar picture, however there is a soaking job we do in the last phase for a single tank to deal with, and some tanks are definitely better than others for doing it. We use a Death Knight for this job and we'll explain why when we get to it. But with the composition stuff out of the way, let's get on to the start of the fight and explain phase 1.
So just like heroic, you want to split your raid into 2 groups and send them off to a ship. Mechanically, both Joseph and Catherine are identical to heroic, it's just the damage from their spells is noticeably higher. You'll want your healers to use their cooldowns throughout phase 1 whenever it feels right to do so, as they're not really needed until late phase 2 where they'll just be back up anyway. The new mechanic added to the ships is the spawns of Laminaria. These guys cannot be attacked and will stand still and cast Sea Swell every 20 seconds. This works the exact same way as the version that you saw on Heroic, spawning a patch of shit under your feet that lasts permanently. However, there is no way of clearing these puddles during the first phase, so instead you're forced to follow a set of rules depending on what boss you're fighting to keep the ships as clear as possible to give you space to deal with other spells. When fighting Catherine, we follow a marked player. Each ship has a marked player with a raid icon, and every player on the ship is responsible for standing on top of them before every sea swell, so all the patches spawn on a single location. The only thing that prevents you from stacking with a group while fighting her is the crackling lightning debuff that you need to drop out of the raid. This however never overlaps with sea swell, and you'll always have time to get back. The only thing to watch out for is the voltaic flash, which does overlap with sea swell. If you have the raid spread randomly trying to dodge the lines when Sea Swell comes in, your ship is just going to be scattered with patches, which isn't ideal. So when fighting Catherine, by having a single player dictate movement and everyone else follow them, will keep the ship as clean as possible. When fighting Brother, we instead have a marked location on the ship to stack on. Joseph's Sea Storm debuffs that's on random players overlaps with the Sea Swell frequently. Whilst it's possible to stack for the Sea Swell and then quickly move out to drop your Sea Storm, it's not easily done and could be pretty dangerous to do so. We instead just let the debuff players place their Swell and Storm around the edges of the ship, and when the overlap comes again in the future, you can just reuse the old patches. Just make sure you don't move into the old patches too early, as you'll take pretty high ticking damage, and with all the movement, healers might struggle to keep you healthy. We use a weak aura to keep track of the timer on the Sea Swell cast, and that can be found in the description of this video. The only other thing to deal with on Joseph's ship is the Siren. These work the exact same way as Heroic, and do not overlap with any other spells, providing you kill them off quickly. Right, so let's move on to the most important part of phase 1, which is the empowerment casts.
Now just like Heroic, the bosses will place an absorb shield on themselves and begin to channel their empowerment onto the boss, giving him energy. Whilst energy going into the boss might seem bad, you actually use this to your advantage. Whilst casting this channel into the boss, Joseph and Catherine are doing no other mechanics whatsoever, which allows you just to plow damage into them for free. As long as Laminaria never gets to 100% energy and the adds do not reach him during phase 2, you can in theory go into the last phase of the boss at 99% energy, and it doesn't matter. So let's explain how we do it. So we personally Bloodlust on the pool and nuke them both down. When they cast their first empowerment cast, they're usually around 55 to 60% health. Note that Joseph will be lower than Catherine if you do a 10-10 split on the ships, as Joseph has slightly less total health. In some cases you may need to stop damage on him, as you do not want him to translocate early. We let this first channel go off until both bosses get to around 52% health, at which point they're interrupted, and then both bosses are pushed below 50% health at the same time, at which point they'll translocate and swap ships. You then have 30 seconds of mechanics until they cast their empowerment for a second time. This time, however, you just do not interrupt them for a very, very long time. During this time, the only thing you need to do is deal with the Sea Swell casts and just nuke the bosses. Whilst doing so, you do need to keep a close eye on their health, as it's important that they die at the same time, whilst also watching out for Laminara's energy. Typically, we interrupt and kill them off when Laminara's energy hits around 70 to 80%, as that allows you to have minor fuck-ups on ads during phase 2. If you wanted to though, you could easily go higher than that. Once you've killed both of them off, you can click the pedestal and phase 2 begins.
So what's new in this phase? Well, now you have to deal with some of the ship abilities. A ghost of Catherine or Joseph will randomly appear throughout the fight and will just do small ticking damage to your raid, which is totally unavoidable. However, Catherine will also spawn voltaic flash lines. There's a few different patterns, all very similar to the ones you've already seen on the ship. The only difference is, you don't really need to dodge them. There isn't really much incoming damage in this last phase, and the lines do not one-shot you, so instead you can just stand still and take the hit. Even if you can move to avoid them, it's really not needed. The only other time damage comes in is when an ad dies and drops the orb on the ground, and this point can easily be covered with a single healing cooldown, and it doesn't happen too frequently. As for Joseph, he will spawn sirens. You'll have one spawn on one side of the platform and one spawn shortly afterwards on the opposite side. This is another reason why ranged DPS are ideal here, as they can swap to them immediately as they spawn and nuke them down. One thing to know with the sirens is that their cast can overlap with Sea Swell. When the siren does cast on you, you are slowed, and being slowed as the Sea Swell comes in is not good, as potentially you could get hit by other players' Sea Swells who aren't perfectly stacked with everyone else. So as a rule, if you're ever targeted by a siren, you've got to move out the stacked raid just to make sure that you don't travel into anyone else's Sea Swell landing zones. And whilst on the topic of Sea Swells, we might as well talk about raid positioning. So as the phase begins, the range moves to the left hand side of the platform on the first Sea Swell cast, and then the group slowly moves down this side of the platform after each swell cast. By the time you reach the bottom, an ad should have died, and you can move or gateway back up to where you started. The only ranged player that is not part of this pack is the single Frost Mage. He's stood far towards the back of the platform, as he's responsible for slowing the ads. And as a side note, the Mage can be targeted by the Siren, which forces you to use backups. We use Death Knight tanks as backups here, as they can use their Death and Decay slows. As for melee positioning, they do a heroic style movement, placing patches in front and then behind and then moving either left or right and repeating. As for tanks, you'll want one of them to keep the boss for the entire fight, and he needs to make sure that he's not positioned on top of other melee, and as soon as he reaches 4 stacks or 5 stacks of Kelp Wrap Fists, that's when you'll want to dispel him. Just note that you do not need to dispel this on any of the ads throughout the fight. The ranged DPS should be capable of killing the ads themselves. As for the other tank, he is responsible for the Ire of the Deep. These circles on Mythic deal 350k frost damage split between all players within. However, this damage on a single tank shouldn't kill them, providing they're topped, and especially if they're using cooldowns, and this is where DKs are so strong. We have the single DK tank soak every single patch for the entire fight, and this is where your monk healer becomes useful, as they can spot heal them between every patch pretty quickly. The Ire of the Deep patches on Mythic also knock back. This effect is also split between all players within it. However, because we only use a single player, they get knocked back quite a fair distance. It's just vital that while you are soaking, you're never positioned in such a way where you could be knocked into the water. We also have a Hunter and a Demon Hunter assigned to soak these patches as a backup with their immunities, as the tank might be knocked far from the next and could have Sea Swell patches in between, which would slow them down. This rarely happens, but it's good to have backups assigned just in case. And mechanically speaking, the last thing to really mention is the ads themselves. We make sure they die before 1, they reach the boss, and 2, the range group reaches the front of the platform. Typically dots alone is enough for this, but on occasion you will have to have ranged hard swap to them just to make sure they die in time. The moment they die, we have a rotation of 2 boomkins, pick up the orb, go into form with dash and bark skin up, and soak patches, prioritising the melee and range patches first, and letting the debuff time out towards the back of the platform. Whilst they're soaking, healers really need to make sure that they spot heal them, as they will be out of range once they reach the back of the platform, and you can't really chase them. This is repeated until the boss hits around the 50% health mark, and it's at this point you'll have to deal with 2 ads simultaneously. This part of the encounter is made worse, as you'll also have sirens come in at the exact same time. This is where the majority of guilds use their 3 minutes and Bloodlust. As we opt to use Bloodlust in phase 1 instead, we only have our 3 minutes. So you've got to nuke down the sirens first, while making sure that both ads die before they reach the boss. To pull this off, you'll pretty much want all your ranged DPS to focus down the ads at this point. Once both ads are dead, we have both of our druids pick up the orbs and take them to the back of the platform, and providing the ads are slowed correctly, you should be able to ignore them for the rest of the fight and just put all remaining damage into the boss and any sirens that spawn. If the 2 adds do reach the boss and he gains 100% energy, you still have 15 seconds to kill the boss before his one-shot cast finishes. During this time you should be able to remove that last bit of percentage needed just to finish off the boss. If you cannot however make this damage, you'll want to look at saving Bloodlust for this phase instead, and just let the first Empowerment cast in phase 1 go on that little bit longer, and interrupt the second one after the translocate a little bit earlier. But that's it for this phase. Have a tank solo the patches, ignore the voltaic flashes and just use healing cooldowns whenever it feels dangerous, use a Frost Mage to keep the ads slowed, stack dot classes for the ads so most of the damage can go into the boss, have your druids pick up orbs and clear patches, and when 2 ads are up, have all range DPS swap and nuke the first set down, and when both are dead, put all damage into the boss and hope you can kill him before he reaches 100% energy and kills you.
Thanks for watching, guys. We hope this guide helped you out. If you would like to know more about this encounter or just have a refresher of what we've shown in this video, then do go check out our written guide over on Wowhead. A link for that can be found in the description below. But that's all for today. We'll catch you in the next one.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.